Michael adjusted the tie that felt like a noose around his neck, staring into the bedroom mirror. His reflection looked calm, composed even, but the storm behind his green eyes told a different story. A week ago, the shadows in Laura's excuses began to form patterns, meetings that didn't line up, nights out with friends that ended in silence, and the faint trace of cologne that wasn't his. It was the kind of truth that he had hoped, foolishly, wasn't real. This evening, Michael planned to verify it. He had always believed in handling matters with precision, whether it was his career in corporate risk management or his marriage. When the stakes were high, the approach had to be surgical, calm, calculating, and unflinching. Laura was radiant as always, her long blonde hair cascading like a golden waterfall over her shoulders. She stood by the dining table, scrolling through her phone. Her bright smile came easy these days, too easy, he thought, like a mask glued in place. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her petite frame, an outfit Michael noted she never wore when they went out together. "Eating out again tonight?" Michael asked casually, pouring himself a glass of water. She glanced up with feigned surprise. "Oh yes, the gallery opening. Remember, I told you about it last week." He'd reviewed her progress with the votes, feeling a certain familiar deep pleasure. Michael didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Right. Who are you going with?" "A few people from the committee." She offered the answer too quickly, her tone practiced. Michael had spent years deciphering lies for work. Her tell was the slight raise of her voice, as if the truth would somehow escape if she didn't lift it higher. "That's nice," he smiled, sipping his water. "I'll probably stay in, catch up on reading." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before offering a bright, practiced smile. "Don't wait up. It'll probably go late." Michael's reply was a soft nod as he watched her pick up her coat. Once the door closed behind her, his calm facade fell like shattered glass. He slipped into his study, where his laptop waited with a secure feed from the tracking device discreetly placed in her car. The screen came alive, a blinking dot showing her location heading toward the city, not toward the gallery. His heart thudded like a metronome set too fast, but his face remained impassive. "You'll confirm everything tonight, Michael. Let her believe this is still her game." 9:15 p.m. The car came to a stop outside an upscale apartment complex. Michael noted the address, opened his phone, and took a screenshot. This was step 1. Gather evidence. Step 2 would require patience, and patience was something he'd honed to an art. Listing the people clinging to the facade of his home would be difficult. He stepped into his coat, slipping his phone into his pocket. Laura's secrets would soon unravel, and when they did, Michael would ensure that the mask she wore shattered spectacularly. Some betrayals deserved a stage, and Michael was ready to build the theater. "Extraordinary what? She's 100 standard digital merits." Michael parked his car 2 streets away from the complex. He'd been here once before, years ago, when a friend had hosted a housewarming party. The building hadn't changed, still gleaming with the unstated elegance of upper-class comfort. But tonight, the place held a different meaning, its walls sheltering the truth he was here to uncover. The chilly night air bit at his face as he walked toward the entrance, careful to blend in with the other passers-by. A surge of anger threatened to surface, but Michael forced it down. This wasn't the time for rage. That would come later, measured, cold, and devastating. The doorman gave him a polite nod, assuming he was a guest. Michael nodded back, stepping inside as casually as if he belonged. He'd done his homework. The security cameras were few, placed in predictable corners. The elevators hummed quietly, each ascending floor feeling like another layer of betrayal peeling away from his chest. He reached the 11th floor and stepped out into a hallway lined with beige walls and Art Deco sconces. At the far end of the corridor, soft laughter echoed faintly. He didn't have to guess which apartment it came from. He'd memorized the address. Michael's chest tightened as he approached. There was something profoundly surreal about standing here, inches away from the confirmation of his worst fears. A part of him wanted to turn around, to leave and pretend this wasn't happening, But the other part, the one driven by justice and pride, knew there was no turning back. A muffled voice came through the door. Laura's, playful, familiar, tinged with a lightness he hadn't heard in months. Then came the deeper, confident tones of a man responding, their voices mixing like threads of a web woven too tightly to escape. Michael withdrew his phone, angling it discreetly toward the crack beneath the door. The device captured their laughter and faint snippets of conversation. "He never notices anything," Laura's voice carried, edged with amusement. "It's almost too easy." "Ah," Michael's jaw tightened, his grip on the phone white-knuckled. Another man's voice followed, smooth and smug. "Because he's too busy playing the perfect husband." It's cute, really. It wasn't the words that hurt. It was the casual cruelty, the way they stripped him of dignity in their shared amusement. For months, Michael had tried to rationalize her late nights and vague excuses, believing that perhaps he wasn't giving her enough attention. But this wasn't neglect. This was calculated. He stepped back, his breath steady, his movements calm. There was no point in barging in now, no satisfaction in angry confrontations. Laura had made her choices, and he would decide how the narrative unfolded from here. Right, in his car, Michael scrolled through the photos he'd taken of the address, the messages logged on her tracking device, and the audio he'd recorded. It was enough. Enough to end the lies. Enough to confront her and her lover in a way that neither would ever forget. As he drove home, Michael envisioned the scene he would orchestrate. One of public humiliation, where their betrayal would be exposed under the spotlight. They had written this story with deceit, and he would write its conclusion with truth. Michael spent the next 2 days refining his plan, his actions deliberate and methodical. His corporate training had taught him the power of preparation, and this moment was no different. He would confront Laura and her lover, but not in private whispers or quiet accusations. No, their betrayal deserved the full weight of exposure. On the morning of the gala, an event Laura insisted she couldn't miss, Michael carefully set the stage. He reviewed his evidence one last time. Photos of her entering the apartment, recordings of her voice dripping with disdain, and the texts he'd pulled from a covertly installed backup app on her phone. Every piece fit together like a puzzle, a clear and damning picture of deceit. The gala itself was a glittering affair held in the ballroom of a luxury hotel downtown. Michael arrived early, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, blending seamlessly with the crowd of affluent professionals and socialites. He spotted Emma, his confidant, across the room and gave her a small nod. She understood her role without words. Michael had briefed her earlier that week. Laura arrived an hour later, her hand resting lightly on the arm of Chris, her lover. She introduced him to the crowd as a business associate, her bright smile and effortless charm betraying no hint of impropriety. Michael stayed in the background, observing. As Laura moved through the room, basking in the attention she craved, Michael felt the weight of anticipation settle over him. The moments leading up to a confrontation were often the most nerve-wracking, but Michael thrived under pressure. He approached the event coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a headset, and handed her a USB drive. "This contains a slideshow for Laura Emerson," he said with a polite smile. "It's a surprise gift. Could you ensure it's displayed after her speech? She'll be thrilled." The coordinator nodded, none the wiser. Michael returned to the main room and waited as the evening unfolded. Laura's speech was as polished as ever, her voice warm and inviting as she spoke about community and collaboration. The audience applauded enthusiastically, and Michael joined them, his hands clapping steadily, his expression unreadable. Then, the lights dimmed, and the projector came to life. The audience expected a montage of Laura's achievements. Instead, the first image was of her entering the apartment with Chris. Gasps rippled through the room as the slideshow progressed. Photos, screenshots of texts, and finally, the recording of her mocking Michael. Michael, manipulative. Laura's face drained of color, her poised demeanor crumbling under the weight of exposure. Chris tried to intervene, but the murmurs of disgust from the crowd drowned him out. Michael stood to address the room, his voice calm yet firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thought you deserved to know the truth about the people you celebrate. Integrity should be more than a word. It should be a standard." He walked out, leaving Laura and Chris to face the fallout, their reputations shattered like glass under the relentless weight of truth. The hours after the gala were a blur of chaos for Laura and Chris. As Michael walked out, he left behind a room simmering with scandal. Guests whispered in hushed tones, eyes darting between Laura's ashen face and the empty doorway Michael had passed through. Laura attempted to regain her composure, but the damage was done. Her carefully curated persona as the sophisticated, ambitious socialite had been shattered. She excused herself under the pretense of feeling unwell, gripping Chris's arm as they retreated into the shadows of the service hallway. "Do something," she hissed, her voice trembling. "What do you want me to do?" Chris shot back, his earlier confidence now replaced with panic. "He set us up. The whole room's sore. We're ruined." Outside, Michael sat in his car, letting the weight of the evening settle in. He wasn't proud of the humiliation he'd orchestrated, but he felt justified. Laura and Chris had played their game with arrogance, and Michael had simply chosen to meet them on their field and beat them at it. Still, beneath the satisfaction, there was an ache. Years of love and trust didn't evaporate overnight. The next morning, Michael woke early, his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. He began making the calls he'd planned for this phase, to his lawyer, to Emma, and to the real estate agent who'd managed the sale of their shared home. He wasn't one for lingering in the wreckage of what could no longer be saved. It was time to rebuild, to move forward. Meanwhile, Laura faced the consequences of her choices in full. The photos and recordings from the gala had already begun circulating online, posted by attendees who couldn't resist sharing the sensational drama. Colleagues from her charity board called to demand explanations, and her boss left a curt voicemail informing her that her position at the company was under review. Chris fared no better. His name became synonymous with scandal, his professional reputation taking a nosedive. His own colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the mess. By midday, his inbox was filled with terse emails from clients, cancelling contracts, citing a need to reassess alignment of values. Laura tried to call Michael several times, but he let the calls go unanswered. The messages that followed were a mix of tearful pleas and sharp accusations. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded in one voicemail, her tone wavering between anger and desperation. "We can fix this. Please, Michael, call me." But Michael didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closing a chapter that had become toxic and ensuring his own peace. He forwarded the messages to his lawyer, documenting every interaction. In the days that followed, Laura moved out of their home, retreating to stay with a friend. For Michael, each step forward felt like shedding the weight of years of betrayal. His life had been upended, but in the rubble of his marriage, he found a strange clarity. The knowledge that he had reclaimed his own narrative. The divorce proceedings began quietly, as Michael had planned. While Laura initially tried to fight back, the overwhelming evidence of her betrayal left little room for argument. Her lawyer advised her to settle, and within weeks Michael found himself signing the final papers that dissolved a marriage of 15 years. The moment was bittersweet. He wasn't vindictive enough to feel joy, but strong enough not to grieve anymore. Michael moved into a smaller, modern apartment downtown, a stark contrast to the suburban home he and Laura had shared. The new space symbolized a fresh start, free from the memories that lingered in every corner of their old house. He took solace in the quiet hum of the city, the anonymity of his new surroundings, offering a sense of liberation. His social circle shifted as well. Emma, his longtime friend and confidant, became a more prominent part of his life. She invited him to casual dinners and introduced him to her friends, gently encouraging him to embrace the possibility of new connections. Michael appreciated her warmth, but approached relationships cautiously. Trust, once shattered, was not easily rebuilt. Laura, on the other hand, struggled to find her footing. The fallout from the gala left her reputation in tatters. Friends distanced themselves, Her career prospects dwindled, and whispers of her affair followed her into every room she entered. Even Chris, her lover, proved unreliable when faced with the harsh realities of their exposed relationship. He disappeared shortly after the gala, leaving Laura to bear the brunt of the consequences alone. For Michael, life began to settle into a new rhythm. He rediscovered hobbies he had neglected during his marriage, reading philosophy, running in the early mornings, and experimenting with cooking. Each activity was a reminder that his identity extended beyond being Laura's husband. He was carving out a life for himself, piece by piece. One Saturday morning, Michael found himself standing at a farmer's market examining fresh herbs when a stranger struck up a conversation. She was a bookstore owner, radiating an easy warmth that caught Michael off guard. Her name was Evelyn, and her curiosity about his choice of basil versus oregano turned into a discussion about favorite recipes and literature. By the time he left the market, he had her business card tucked into his pocket. Later that evening, Michael sat on his balcony, sipping a glass of wine as the city lights glittered below. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he had reclaimed control over his life. Laura's betrayal had tested him, pushed him to the edge of his composure, but it had also forced him to confront what he truly valued: honesty, respect, and a life lived authentically. Scars of the past remained, faint but present. Yet Michael viewed them not as marks of pain, but as reminders of his resilience. The chapter with Laura had closed, but his story was far from over. In the quiet of the evening, with the world spread out before him, Michael allowed himself to smile. For the first time in years, the future felt like his own.